Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving deep into the true mechanics of how public policy is actually shaped in this country. When most of us hear the word corruption, a very specific image pops into our heads. We immediately picture a scene straight out of a Hollywood movie, right? An envelope stuffed with cash sliding across a table, or some secret backroom deal in a smoky, dimly lit room. But today we're going way beyond that stereotype to look at the reality of how modern influence actually works.
Prepare to have some of your preconceived notions dismantled, because modern corruption, it often looks incredibly clean. It's not always hidden in the shadows. In fact, it is frequently perfectly legal, and it operates right in plain sight. It can look like a routine campaign contribution, a fancy donor retreat, or a really complex government contract. What we're going to explore today is how these highly visible, totally normal systems can be powerful enough to shape exactly whose interests the government protects.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to cover 1. The myth of bribery, 2. The price of access, 3. The inside game, 4. The payout, 5. The delay of public input, and finally 6. Demanding accountability. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The myth of bribery, beyond envelopes of cash.
There is a huge, stark contrast between what is strictly illegal and what is simply considered how the game is played. Now, federal law absolutely criminalizes direct bribery, giving or taking something of value to influence an official act. A prime example is the 2025 case of former U.S. Senator Robert Menendez. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison for bribery, foreign agent, and obstruction offenses. That is your classic criminal quid pro quo. But here is the catch. Most policy influence happens without a provable one-for-one exchange. Organized interests don't need to hand over a literal bribe. Instead, they use completely legal tools. We're talking registered lobbyists, independent expenditures, and campaign contributions. So, the absolute crucial takeaway here is this. Legal does not always mean accountable. A practice can raise massive accountability red flags even when it doesn't fit the narrow legal definition of a crime.
Section 2. The price of access, following the money.
Shaping the political playing field requires a staggering, almost unimaginable amount of resources before a single voter even casts a ballot. Just let this number sink in for a second. $15.7 billion. That's how much PACs raised in just the 2023 to 2024 cycle alone. Add to that $3.8 billion in candidate spending, plus over $4.4 billion in independent spending. Now, this money doesn't guarantee a specific policy outcome, but it buys unparalleled visibility. It helps dictate who can afford to run, who can blanket the airwaves with ads, and who stays top of mind for voters. Money essentially sets the field long before Election Day, handing a massive megaphone to those with major donor support. And the spending absolutely does not stop once the elections are over. Over $4.43 billion. That is exactly how much companies, trade groups, and other entities spent just to lobby Congress and federal agencies in 2024. And reporting shows that federal lobbying spending actually crossed the $5 billion mark in 2025. Now, lobbying itself isn't inherently corrupt. Everyone has a constitutional right to petition the government. But these numbers brilliantly illustrate a massive gap in access. Think about it. An everyday community member might get 3 quick minutes at a public microphone. Meanwhile, a highly paid lobbyist, backed by a fraction of that $5 billion, can work on a single issue for months, literally shaping the language of a bill before the public even knows it exists. Disclosure of all this spending is a good thing, sure, but disclosure definitely does not equal access.
And honestly, sometimes there isn't even disclosure. This brings us to the alarming, explosive growth of what we call dark money. This is spending by nonprofits and shell companies that simply aren't legally required to disclose who their donors are. We went from about $1 billion of this in the 2020 cycle to a conservative estimate of $1.9 billion in 2024. This tidal wave of outside spending really accelerated after the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. And for voters, the practical issue here is deeply concerning. When the funders are hidden, you see the political message, but you have zero idea what financial interest is actually paying to push it. At the end of the day, less transparency ultimately means weaker accountability.
Section 3. The inside game, watchdogs and revolving doors.
So much of the influence within government offices happens through what we call the revolving door. That's the constant movement of personnel between government roles and private sector roles. While there are a few legal restrictions on what you can do right after you leave office, a former official's inside knowledge is an incredibly marketable asset. They know exactly how the agency thinks, they know the key staff on a first-name basis, they know exactly which definitions have a little wiggle room, and they know where the agency's enforcement priorities are weak. Again, Absolutely no bribery is required here, just relationships, incentives, and inside expertise.
And this naturally leads us to a fascinating but dangerous concept known as regulatory capture. This is basically when the government watchdog starts serving the industry it's supposed to be watching. How does it happen? Through relentless industry pressure, that revolving door employment we literally just talked about, technical dependence on industry-provided data, or just the looming threat of expensive litigation. A captured system might still hold public hearings and use all the right language about public protection, but the actual real-world outcomes, they protect the industry, not the public.
Section 4. The payout. Profiting from public money.
$755 billion. That is roughly what the federal government spent on contracts in fiscal year 2024 alone. Now, government spending isn't automatically a bad thing or automatically corrupt. It builds our roads, our hospitals, and funds disaster recovery. But public spending at that scale inherently creates massive private business opportunities. Companies spend millions lobbying specifically for these contracts, subsidies, and tax incentives. Influence operates on an enormously visible, incredibly lucrative scale right here.
And without incredibly strict oversight, all that public money can easily be exploited. Take the Raytheon case from 2024, for example. The Department of Justice announced that Raytheon agreed to pay over $950 million to resolve investigations. What were they investigating? Defective pricing on government contracts, foreign bribery, and export control violations. This completely grounds this concept in reality for us. Public contracts fund vital national needs, but they demand intense ongoing oversight. Public money should always produce public value, not hidden overcharges or private gain without any accountability.
You know, influence also loves to hide in plain sight behind really dry technical language. When a new policy proposes a clarification, the immediate accountability question we have to ask is, okay, who actually benefits from this new interpretation? When they propose an incentive, we have to ask, who exactly gets the subsidy? And when we hear buzzwords like modernization or flexibility, we need to immediately stop and ask, wait, what protection is being weakened here and whose risk is increasing? We all have to learn how to translate this seemingly boring policy jargon into these essential, hard-hitting questions.
Section 5. The delay of public input, managed participation. This right here is a massive source of frustration for ordinary people who just feel completely unheard by their government. A community might finally be granted a brief 3 minutes at a microphone at a town hall or a public hearing. But guess what? That hearing usually happens only after companies, highly paid consultants, and political insiders have already spent months, maybe years, quietly shaping the very terms of that contract or zoning change. In fact, a landmark 2014 Princeton study tested this exact dynamic. They concluded that economic elites and organized business groups have a substantial impact on policy, while average citizens have almost zero independent influence. When the public is invited to comment long after the big decisions are essentially already negotiated, it's not equal participation, it's managed participation.
Section 6. Demanding accountability. Breaking the cycle.
The 99% perspective lays out this exact cycle of influence, and you have to follow it step by step to understand how it works. It starts with money. Who is funding the campaigns and the outside groups? Money buys access. Who is getting the private meetings and those lucrative revolving door jobs? Access shapes policy. Who gets to write the proposed language and the technical exemptions? Policy dictates enforcement. Do the regulatory agencies actually have the staff and the independence to act? And finally, enforcement determines the actual outcomes for the public. If we want to demand accountability, we literally have to track this entire life cycle. And as you track it, you need to internalize a quick mental checklist whenever you evaluate a new public contract, a development deal, or a policy proposal. Ask yourself 3 simple things. 1. Who benefits from this decision? 2. Who pays or carries the risk if this policy or project fails? And crucially, 3. Who audits the result after the public money is spent to ensure we actually got the promised value?
Ultimately, it all comes down to this core truth. Transparency without consequences is documentation, not accountability. Think about it. A 200-page agenda packet released just days before a city council vote is technically transparent, right? But it's totally meaningless if the public can't digest it in time. A lobbying disclosure form is entirely useless if the language is too vague. Real transparency has to be timely, written in plain language, and connected to strict enforcement. Without actual penalties for violations, rules just become polite suggestions.
So, to wrap this all up, corruption in plain sight is often perfectly legal. It operates through influence, complex contracts, and tiny technical rule changes. But make no mistake, it is incredibly powerful.
And remember, this isn't about calling out one political party over another. Both major parties operate inside this same money-driven system. It's about recognizing a structure that actively rewards access. Because if the rules of the game are consistently written by the people who can afford to play, it leaves us with one critical, lingering question. Who is our system actually protecting? Next up, we're going to be diving into the bias built into the system, looking closely at how race, class, gender, disability, and geography shape economic opportunity. Be sure to read the 99% Perspective for the full analysis of today's topic, and please subscribe for more explainers. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.